we will have now three absolutely incredible speakers. The first one is David Amerland from England, but he is in Greece actually now. Okay, let's go on. Let's. David, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm trying to enjoy the weather. It's really warm.
I envy you. I wish I were in Greece and enjoy, but instead of enjoying the weather and the sun and the sea, you're doing a conference with us. Thank you very much, David. And I don't really want to. Okay, David Amerland. We have David Amerland with us. David, it's all yours. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. And today we're looking at artificial intelligence in search engine optimization. And really, what I would have loved to say to everybody is that the moment we introduce AI in search, well, everything becomes so easy. We don't really need to try very hard. SEO becomes incredibly easy. We can all sort of take a breath and sit back. Now, unfortunately, this is not the case. Not the case at all. How has it ever been in search, you may well ask. And essentially, at the bottom of it is that what happens at the core of search is a 15-year-old message that Google has been peddling since Google started on the web, which is focus on the user. Now, that doesn't sound very exciting, and it doesn't sound like it has a lot to do with artificial intelligence, but I will get to that in a minute. What we need to actually realize is that though the message of focus on the user is very old, it has actually morphed and changed as the web morphs and changes, and as technology actually changes with it. So essentially, the old phrase of the more things change, the more they remain the same is true, but their execution changes and everything else around it changes. And we'll see how that, as the presentation goes on, I'll actually explain how that impacts everything we do. And really, we need to start with RankBrain, the ever misnamed RankBrain, because a lot of people think it has to do with ranking, and it hasn't. Google hasn't really helped to change a lot here by saying that it's the third most important ranking signal in search at the moment. So let's unpack this a little bit just to understand what it is. And essentially, RankBrain is used, it's machine learning algorithm that is used to examine 15% of daily queries that Google gets, which are either difficult to understand, or they're new, or there's not sufficient information about them, or there's not sufficient context to actually decode them. Now, 15% may not sound like many. It's about 500 million searches per day. Google gets about 40,000 search queries a second, which works out about 3.5 billion a day globally, and RankBrain examines 15% of them. So how does it do it? Well, here's the technical explanation. RankBrain essentially takes those queries and it injects them into vectors, and vectors are mathematical entities that the search algorithms can then work with in order to understand a search query better in relation to the web page's content. And all this may as well sound about the same in Chinese. So let's unpack it a little bit with an example. Essentially, in many ways, when we go into the higher vector, higher dimensionality mathematics that machine learning uses and RankBrain uses, we go back to the old notion of keyword density. In a sense, not exactly, and I will explain that. So let's think for a minute. Let's take an example. And let's say you have a room with 5 experts. In that room, you have a project. You need those 5 experts to actually complete it. Those 5 experts have specific tools around their waist in a tool belt, and you assign to each of them a specific numeric value. So perhaps the guy with the power tools around his waist, you need him for 10% of the project, and you give him a value of 3, maybe. Then guy with a hammer, because you need to use a hammer throughout the project, you give him a value of 8 or 9. And the guy with the nails, because you always need nails, you also give him an 8 or a 9. And here's the interesting thing with those 5 people. The moment, for instance, that you lose the guy with the nails from the room, the guy with a hammer acquires a value of his own, but the value that he has relative to the project suddenly drops because you have no nails. So this gives you an example of how vectors assign values to pages on the web and specific keywords within those pages. And let's complicate this a little bit and say the 5 guys you have in the room become 150. So suddenly, the fluidity of those relationships between them, the value you would ascribe to them in terms of the project which you want to complete, would change all the time. Now, essentially, that's what vectors do. And that's what RankBrain does in terms of search queries. So it takes those queries. It doesn't parse them in the traditional sense that Hummingbird does, but it ascribes them a specific value in relation to the page, the content of the web page, the page on the web in relation to other pages, or even the lack of other pages, and then determines how accurate they are. Now, why is this important at all? Well, it is important because a machine learning algorithm can do this a lot better than a human can. And it can do it in surprisingly simple queries. And one of the examples that Google has given on this, which is absolutely fascinating, is the query of, can you get a 100% score on Super Mario, the video game, without a walkthrough? And apparently, when Google's traditional algorithm looks at that, it doesn't actually factor without in that search query, which is a negative connotation. But RankBrain actually does, and it actually delivers surprisingly accurate results. There are two caveats here, two things to actually examine. First of all, the moment you have artificial intelligence in search, especially in organic search, you cede a certain amount of control, which is something Google does extremely slowly. And what I mean by that is that if, for instance, we get some funny results in search, in the past Google could actually go in, manually manipulate the algorithms, tweak them, and get the results to correct themselves. But with machine learning, this is not the case, because when the results are actually arrived at through artificial intelligence, the process which gives us the answer that we see is not always as transparent, which means that for the team which actually monitors all this, in order to fix it, within inverted commas, they have to go back to the beginning, perhaps make some different suppositions, tweak those original points a little bit, run the tests, run the experiments, run the learning sets, see if they get a different outcome. So it's quite a lengthy process. It's not an easy fix, which in terms of how search works creates problems in its own, because we are all used to search. It's obviously being very responsive, changing very quickly, and Google being very responsible about it. So, having all that now, if we look at how organic search, how artificial intelligence works in terms of how search is actually changing, it's a classic case of man against machine. So basically, the old search of the past and the current search of today in terms of the 85% that actually works within Hummingbird is very much rules-based, and those rules-based are determined by the assumptions and the discoveries and the insights that the people who create search actually arrive at. And the 15% of it is determined by, again, there's some rules to begin with, but they're very small. And as the process goes on, they're determined by essentially an algorithm which is mathematically based and not very obvious or easy to control from a human point of view. Does this change search, you will say? You know, it is obviously interesting from a geek's point of view, but does it have any kind of impact in terms of how we use it? And the easy answer to this is probably not, but actually this is not true. Because essentially search in today's world takes place through content, context, and relevance. And those three things have to come together in order for a particular outcome to be arrived at. And how responsive that outcome is in terms of the search query and the quality of the answer we get is determined by the ability of search to actually understand the content, understand the context, and understand the relevance. Now, how do we carry out search today? And artificial intelligence actually impacts very much on that. Now, if we carry out search on a desktop, nothing much seems to have changed very much. You know, we still go into Google or Bing or Yandex or Baidu. We type in a search query in the search box, and we actually get an answer back. So in terms of that, search seems to be very traditionally driven and not very much change in terms of the AI that powers it. But the moment we get away from that, the moment we go to our devices, which most of us do, the moment we start using search, voice search, for instance, or the moment we start using an app like a chatbot, which will ask it some kind of particular question, will give us an answer. Although we don't realize it, we're actually using search in different ways. So here's a morphing of the context of use, if you like, from an end user's point of view, which does have a significant impact on how search driven by AI actually takes place. And for instance, Bing has invested quite heavily in terms of artificial intelligence and chatbots. They have Cortana as its in the operating system, and that is search in itself. and it also has an impact on the user. And in China, they've had quite a significant gain through a chatbot called Zioish, which essentially supplies the end user with search results through a voice search interface, and it is very, very successful. Now, all of those things are examples of voice search altering the relationship of the end user with a traditional search. And the moment that happens, the mindset itself begins to shift, and the search queries begin to shift, and also the outcomes begin to shift. Because when you're using voice search, the context is certainly going to be different, but also we're looking most of the times for a very quick answer, as opposed to a number of web pages which we need to go to. If that changes, then obviously the content itself changes. The strategy behind the content creation is going to change. The way people who drive web pages for their marketing is going to change. So that thinking has to follow along. So the traditional question of, should we follow the search engines or should we follow the users? Well, you always think of the users, which we go back to the original message of Google in terms of how we should be behaving, and we shouldn't really be worrying about this at all. But that doesn't mean we should be ignorant or simply discard the changes which are happening in this space. So if we're talking about how that changes SEO in terms of the long-term effects of search, well, it's quite significant because decisions need to be made. If we're looking, for instance, for driving brand and creating brand awareness and creating trust and trustworthiness, the simplistic answers that are projected by Google Voice Search or Cortana within certain contexts, or any kind of chatbot, they directly impact on the kind of content which we create on a website. But in order for that content to be trustworthy, either the website itself has to be extremely trustworthy, or the content itself has to be the kind of content that is easy to aggregate and present, so there is extended verification of its accuracy. But content that is easy to aggregate and present doesn't give us any uniqueness, doesn't drive our brand, and it could even be argued that it doesn't even give us the kind of impact that we expect to have with the audience. So there has to be some kind of critical awareness of how that content which we create answers the needs of the audience, which then requires a very granular approach towards understanding what is important to our audience at any given context in time. So sometimes it may be perfectly all right to give them simplistic answers, and at other times there may be the need to create content that is actually deeper in terms of what they need to find and create a kind of added value that they perhaps don't always expect, but they're always delighted to find. That now begins to change the approach that we actually have. And to illustrate how important content is in terms of what we create, I mean, even in Russia, Yandex uses its web browser artificial intelligence recommendation engine, Zen, in order to present content to its different users, which is directly related to their interests, therefore broadening how they discover content on the web. So you're listening to all this, of course, thinking, okay, do I do something? Do I do nothing? Is there a shortcut I can take? And let's answer those three things as we go forward. Certainly, you could choose to do nothing and hope and pray, but hope is not a strategy, and prayer doesn't work very well in SEO. Do we do something in terms of a shortcut? Well, unfortunately, there's no shortcut you can take, and this is becoming more and more evident as we move forward into the granular, highly fragmented, but definitely united within a broader context, digital world of today. So the shortcuts of the past, which work perhaps in a very simplified way, don't work any longer. Which means that you've got to do something. And the question here is, what is that something that you actually need to do? Well, if you're really serious about your content, your SEO, your long-term marketing strategy, working in an environment which is becoming more and more technology-driven, and perhaps even so highly technical that it begins to lose the connectivity between what we understand and what we should be doing, well, you should be looking to basically connect as much of your data as possible to create as greater a depth in terms of your digital presence as possible. And why are you doing this? You're doing this because the more information there is out there for you, the easier it is for search to understand what you do, why you do things, how you do them, and what impact they have in terms of the search queries that are presented by the searcher. The greater is your opportunity to have higher visibility in search, to find new prospects, which perhaps you can turn into customers when you have products and services, and to serve those needs better. Obviously, you cannot create content in any way in a vacuum. You really need to understand who your people are. You need to understand who your audience is, which means there's really no escape of the social aspect of the web. Now, I've got to clarify here that the common misconception that you constantly need to create content is not actually true. You don't need to do that. If you can, and if you do, it's a plus. But if you have a set amount of pages on the web, which is relatively static, and it does the job because it's quite a great depth, then what you actually need is a strong social component. You need to help people find that content and actually understand its value. You need to basically entice them to understand its uniqueness, and then be so enthusiastic about it that they help promote it to the wider web. So there's no escape from the social element, which you need in order to bring in all those that you would actually require to make your business function. So what do you need? You need a strong social signal, always. You need to be close to your customers in terms of who they are, what their interests are. You need to understand that your website now needs to have as much depth as possible, even if it's static. And you don't need to worry very much about optimizing for artificial intelligence, because really there is no such thing at the moment. And with that, I think we can pretty much wrap it up. I hope it helped you understand a little bit about how artificial intelligence works in search. Essentially, in many ways, it's almost like a step back. Keywords matter, links matter, keyword density matters, but not in the simplistic way which we had in the past, which means that you shouldn't worry about them, actually worry about creating normal content which has a strong impact, because that creates the kind of signature that artificial intelligence looks at when it actually looks at the content of your website. Thank you for listening.
Peter Heatherley, I don't know, you know him, you heard of him, from New Zealand, and he created a tool, you probably know, but for sake of our audience, I said this tool emulate, according to his engineers, emulate actually artificial intelligence, actually rank brain or something. So which actually, from his point of view, help you to optimize it. Have you heard about it?
Yes, I have. I mean, I know of Peter's work, and I think it helps in terms of having a semantic awareness of content and context, and that always helps. But even if Google gave us right now a very clear understanding of how RankBrain looked at a website, that wouldn't solve anything. We would still have to do very real work in order to get somewhere. There would be no shortcut. All that we would perhaps be able to see, arguably, are the shortcomings of a particular website in terms of a particular set of web search queries. So essentially, although all these tools give us a slightly greater awareness in terms of context, content, and relevance, they don't make it any easier. We still have to do the hard work, and they only help partially, especially if we have had no idea of all these connections in the past. I would say that any kind of really truly passionate business person working on the web today has a very clear understanding of how their work impacts and connects with their audience. And then the challenge is, how do I then get that connection, that impact, that passion across, not necessarily always in terms of creating new content, but certainly in terms of connecting with the social element or the social aspect of the web, creating with that audience, and making them aware of the existence of the website in the first instance.
You were talking about everything It's obviously applies to English language, because obviously when we talk about artificial intelligence and everything, in search, you're talking about phrase with or without everything. Languages are very different. Not every, but some languages are very different. Surely Chinese, for example, is completely, I don't know much about Chinese, but Russian and English, for example, they're quite different languages. And Google works with Russian quite well, I can tell you. But what about artificial intelligence? Do you think artificial intelligence, ring brain and all this stuff, works as good in Mongolian as in English?
Well, there's an easy answer to that, and there's a complicated answer. Now, the easy answer is no.
Time for complicated answer.
Okay, but let's look at the complicated answer. Essentially, artificial intelligence is a car, and let's think of it as a Ferrari, which is constantly getting better and better. But what it needs in order to run on is a decent road, and a decent road is data. And the greater the depth of data there is, then the better it will run. So in order for search, and this is semantic search, in any kind of morphology, whether it's voice search or desktop search or device search, or even any sort of app-related search like Google Now or Cortana or Alexa, for instance, which is the Amazon equivalent, or Siri, which is Apple. Now, what they all need is data, which has to be not just data, but also of sufficient depth and of high quality. And this is not very easy to get. So although perhaps we could say that it's relatively easy to get the mass of data that you need, which is not a given in itself, it is always harder then to clarify that data, to clean it up and actually find its relevance. Google is extremely good at doing this, but it has to do it anew for each language. So essentially it has to build a semantic index for Mongolian, and then it has to clarify that index and create entities within it and create points of trustworthiness and create a benchmark and constantly keep on improving it. And if we go back to my example of the 5 people in the room who have different values because they can help us complete the project, let's think about it. The moment we give them a numeric value and we think we understand their worth to the project, the moment they've done their part, their numeric value in relation to our project has dropped because we don't need them anymore. That doesn't give them zero value, it just gives them zero value in terms of the project. In terms of themselves, they also have some kind of value which we would ascribe in terms of skills or the tools they have and so on. Now, this kind of fluidity, which is so difficult to express normally, happens in instances within semantic search and artificial intelligence all the time. And within every language, we get specificities of difficulty, which perhaps come from having data to access, having access to data, having a specific history within that particular language, having sufficiently evolved social web for that country to actually get corroborative signals from, and so on. It's worth noting that Bing, who basically invented some of the semantic search concepts, were very poor at executing them because they were late in terms of how they applied them, and then they didn't have sufficient data to refine them. And they had to withdraw from the international stage. So that shows a little bit of the difficulty and complexity. It is very easy for us as users, and very frustrating as well, to see that search doesn't work as well as we expect. Even though we know it's super smart and super powerful, it's still sometimes very dumb and very easy to game and very poor at the results that it gives us. But there are specific reasons for that, which will hopefully go away as it gets more signals, more data, more usage patterns, and so on. So in perhaps a perfect world, the Mongolian search index would become as good as the American one within a very short frame of time. I'm not quite sure what that frame of time is at the moment.
Yeah, probably, and Google obviously has to invest in it, and well, all money speaks English so well, always.
Yes, yes.
We do have it's not a question, it's kind of a request. Christian Drisdale asking, can you talk a bit more about the connection between passion and search, please? I'm not particularly sure what she...
Passion and search. Okay, well, essentially, I mean, Yandex also uses artificial intelligence.
Passion.
Oh, passion and search, right, sorry. Essentially, if anybody's in business, I mean, you set up a website, hopefully, I mean, obviously everybody goes into business to make money and make a living. This is perfectly understandable. But if you don't also feel a particular drive for what you do, then it becomes very difficult for you to connect with your audience in a way that makes them your audience. And I'll give you an example here. Suppose there's a huge market in tulips. And I think, oh, that's an easy one. I've got $1,000. I'm going to invest in tulips and sell them and make some money. Great idea. And then I've got a horticulturalist who actually lives and breathes tulips, and to him they are something amazing. The content which he will produce, as opposed to the content I will produce, is going to be so entirely different that when you get to his website, you probably wouldn't want to leave. Whereas when you get to my website, what you get is tulips are great, you know, they make your day colorful, they make you feel good. Here's where you can buy them from my website. And that's the difference. Now, if I do my job well enough, I'll probably make some sales and get some money. But the horticulturalist will connect with an audience that will go back again and again, and he will basically expand their horizons. And that's how the passion for what you do now can be translated in a digital domain in a way that directly impacts your audience and makes you win them at the critical stage where they become your audience, which means that they begin to think of you when it comes to the purchasing decision. And that essentially is what search creates within that content creation matrix. And how does it do that? Well, if somebody finds your website and they love your content and they love the way you do things and they basically buy from you and they're delighted, they go and tell everybody else in a social network, they amplify your presence, they create that very powerful corroborative signal that comes from social interaction, which then helps your website rise in visibility, it makes it rise in trustworthiness, it has an impact in terms of user behavior when they get to your website. And these again are signals which Google tends to look at and search engines tend to look at, which also help corroborate all the tiny little things which give us a sense of something being real and having real value. And that's the big difference.
We have very little time. We have comment from Chile, and Christian saying it's not the data, it's a language processing of a particular language. So he doesn't really agree. He thinks vectors has to be adjusted or something. Yeah, I'm not sure.
No, well, when it comes to artificial intelligence or machine learning, the way they actually parse each search query has nothing to do with the way that Hummingbird does in a traditional sense, which uses natural language processing architecture and guidelines. Now, machine learning obviously takes some of that on board, but the way they actually find patterns within language itself and then determine what a search query says in terms of the value that it has to the user is totally different. And the process by which machine learning arrives there isn't entirely obvious to a non-human user. Now, obviously, it is mathematics, and we can say, oh yeah, these are the calculations, and this is what is being used, and this is how it goes. But the bottom line is, it is so complex that it becomes very difficult for the human user to actually say, oh, this is how the RankBrain, this is how RankBrain arrived at that process, which is what makes it so difficult. So it is very much a data problem. And the higher the quality of the data, the less likelihood of things going wrong.
Yeah, okay, I hope it answers Christian remark. We have very little time. Just very quick question. You mentioned Bing, and but yes. Bing obviously is not. Well, I can't say it's nowhere because our next speaker is from Bing. So to make kind of bridge, why Bing is not as good, is not as popular. Put it this way, is not as popular as Google. What's wrong with it?
I'm not sure. Well, I don't think I can entirely qualify the disparity in popularity because Bing or Microsoft was there first in terms of search. It predated Google. And in terms of programming and the quality of its engineers, and certainly the patterns they brought out and the quality of their thinking, Microsoft, started out first and they had very clear direction and they really understood what they needed to do. They were perhaps not as good at...
Okay, it's probably a very big issue, Google and Bing and Baidu, but we don't have a time anymore. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we're gonna go to the next one. Next one is gonna be Bing. Thank you very much, David. Thank you and bye.
Bye bye.